Chuck Collins is a senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies, IPS, directs IPS's program on inequality and the common good. He's the author of several books, including 99 to 1, How Wealth Inequality is Wrecking the World and What We Can Do About It. In 1995, Chuck co-founded United for a Fair Economy, a groundbreaking effort that spawned an extensive network of groups doing popular education and organizing to address the crisis of growing inequality. This fall, Chuck was arrested trying to stop the Spectra gas pipeline running through Dedham and West Roxbury. Due to the efforts of activists in those communities and of their supporters like Chuck, work on that pipeline has been suspended. So let's welcome Chuck.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good morning. Good morning. What a time we are living in. If you think about it, we are kind of like between two worlds. The world as it is and the world that is becoming. And every day we see new evidence that social movements are starting to change the possibilities for the future. Now, I think that the context for our day is around us. We see how acute the system failures are in our economy, environment, the mass incarceration system. We're seeing these system failures. We're also seeing how predatory capitalism is almost, I say, doubling down to extract more wealth from workers and our communities and from Mother Earth. And yet there are these movements for resilience and resistance and reparations that are stepping up in a way that we could not have imagined even months or years ago. I have been working for a couple decades on these issues of wealth inequality and racial equity. I remember it wasn't long ago that people said 99 to 1 as a way to think about the wealth divide. And then we learned like a year ago that actually most of the wealth and income gains of the last 5-6 years have gone to the wealthiest 1/10 of 1%. And now I'm here to tell you that actually, even within that, the concentration of wealth and power has become even more extraordinary and extreme. That we saw 158 billionaire families now have contributed half of all the political contributions in the 2016 election cycle. That the wealthiest Forbes 400, the 400 wealthiest family today, now have more wealth than the entire African American population and a third of the Latino population combined. Each year that we track this, it becomes more staggering. It's a reflection of a deep system failure. And yet our movements are emerging. Think of the Black Lives Matter movement. Think of what's happening on campuses as we sit here, how the conversations are changing. Think about the people's diplomacy movement, how 1,000 people came out last night, probably more, to challenge Governor Baker's assertion around Syrian refugees. I have been very encouraged about the intersection of the labor movement and the environmental movement and communities that are coming together to press for a just transition to a future economy, recognizing we can't address the climate crisis or climate change without addressing the deep inequities in our society. And there are these local movements, local transition efforts, building new food systems, new energy, livelihoods, and jobs rooted in a local resilient economy. As Jennifer said, I've been getting more involved in the movement to stop the construction of new fossil fuel infrastructure. And as your children leave, my children leaving home, people take up new hobbies. My hobby is stopping fossil fuel infrastructure in my neighborhood. And our Resist the Pipeline effort, we were told that basically it's over. You've lost. This pipeline is going to be built. And yet for some reason, 450 people have decided that they're going to pledge to nonviolently stop construction of this pipeline. And we had 45 this fall. We had like about 90 to 100 people already scheduled. Some of the people in this room were scheduled for this Monday, to block construction. And Spectra decided to go back to Texas, take the winter off. But This is the kind of thing you'll all have a chance come spring. I mean, we hope they don't come back, but should they come back, we're going to demonstrate a level of local resistance to extractive fossil fuel industry that Boston has never seen. So come on over. The final action was last week. 15 mothers and grandmothers were arrested, ranging in age from 28 to 83, including my partner Mary. And there were 4 people there from a church in Bedford. And I said, so what brings you to West Roxbury? And they said, well, our congregation just passed a resolution, and that's why we're here. We have to be here. I said, let me see this resolution. And I read it, and I have to say, I got goosebumps as I read it. It has the usual whereases, we should not extract fossil fuels, etc. But it has this provision. Be it resolved by the First Parish in Bedford that the congregation recognizes that we have an inherent right to a livable climate, and that right trumps laws legitimizing the continued extraction and consumption of fossil fuels. It trumps the laws. And then it goes on to say that the members of the congregation have a moral obligation to stand in solidarity with frontline communities in their efforts to oppose fossil fuel infrastructure. So you see, those people had no choice. They had to be there. They're saying, we're not going to go quietly. We're going to build a culture of resistance and community that enables this to be possible. So there's an awakening. And today we're here with the theme, Gathering, Building Sustainable Security. All these movements for peace, democracy, the environment are asking questions about what are the drivers of the systems. And we're coming to the recognition that behind each of these struggles that we're involved with is a system, a predatory capitalist system that is driving us to these brinks. And it's universalizing, it's moving itself into every corner of our existence. So our question is, can we universalize resistance to that system across these sectors? This isn't just talking about intersectionality, which is how does my issue overlap or connect with yours. It's sort of like learning a new language, learning a new way of thinking and being, and recognizing and seeing that convergence. So I think our work today is to say, what would that look like to universalize resistance? What does it look like to mesh and merge and become one in our understanding and our analysis and our actions together? I just heard a new song by Jackson Browne called If I Could Be Anywhere. And he says, you know, standing on the shimmering surface between two worlds, which is kind of where I think we are, standing at the center of time as it uncurls, if I could be anywhere in time, if I could be anywhere and change the outcome, it would have to be now. So we are blessed to live in this moment, to be here today, to contemplate and to learn from one another and invite one another into taking the next step for each of us in building these movements. And we are going to start with this terrific panel here. And let me introduce, at least 4 of our panelists are here, and I think another one is on her way. Harris Screwman is the executive director of SEIU Massachusetts, the state council. He is the Massachusetts political director for the Service Employees International Union. I've known him for many years. Many of you know him when he was the director of Neighbor to Neighbor Massachusetts, building power in low-income communities across the Commonwealth. He is the co-chair of Raise Up Massachusetts, which has successfully raised our minimum wage, helped win mandatory earned sick time for workers, and is now campaigning to fund schools and transportation through a millionaire tax. Maybe some of you were among those who, the 155,000 people who signed and collected signatures to get this, the first phase of getting this on the ballot in 2018. So we're very thankful that Harris is here. I don't know, I sometimes see him in his honk band leadership role over there in Somerville too. So he's all around Harris Truman. Carl Williams is a staff attorney at the ACLU of Massachusetts. He's previously a criminal defense attorney with the Roxbury Defenders Unit of the Committee for Public Counsel Services. He's a graduate of the University of Rhode Island and the University of Wisconsin Law School. Longtime resident of Roxbury, he's been an activist and organizer on issues of war, immigrant rights, LGBT rights, racial justice, and Palestinian self-determination. Verena Deloney is the president of the Massachusetts Teachers Association, a strong advocate for students and educators in the state's public schools and higher education system. She's committed to growing an activist union that builds alliances with parents, students, and community members to give educators a strong voice in public education. The MTA has been a totally solidarity partner in our struggle in West Roxbury against the West Lateral Pipeline. So they're teachers working against pipelines as well. While teaching at UMass Amherst School of Education, she supported her students who boycotted the corporatized test system. Her protest put her in conflict with the UMass administration and was the subject of a major article in the New York Times. Susan Redlick, my dear friend, is on the fossil fuel divestment core team of 350 Massachusetts, longtime activist for equitable food systems. In the past, she's been a public sector employee with environmental protection programs in the Commonwealth, and most recently the manager of the Massachusetts Wetlands Restoration Partnership. And Cassandra Bensahi is co-director of Ex-Prisoners and Prisoners Organizing for Community Advancement, Epica. She's joined Epica as a volunteer in 2008, served on the board of directors, and is the president and vice president, and she's worked with the Mass Alliance of HUD Tenants, as well as active with the Jobs Not Jails Coalition. So, let's give it up for our first panel and turn it back to Jennifer.
All right, thanks for all the introductions. We'll be starting with Harris Screwman.
Sure. Start like that. So, good morning, brothers and sisters, as we say in the union movement, and I would like to start with, does anybody remember the book, What's the Matter with Kansas by Thomas Frank? Does anybody remember that book? That was back in 2006. This journalist, Thomas Frank, wrote a book following the George Bush's re-election. He was motivated to write about the problem of why a state like Kansas, where most people are really struggling to survive on very limited incomes, was voting from city council all the way up to president of the United States for people who are directly opposed to their economic interests. And he said, well, okay, this is a big problem. We've all heard that problem and can imagine what we think about it. But he dropped by earlier this year at my office to talk to me about a new book he's writing called What's the Matter with Massachusetts. And I think, as Nadine pointed out, there is a problem with Massachusetts, and Cambridge even more so perhaps, that is actually more relevant to what we're talking about today than what's the matter with Kansas. So what is the matter with Massachusetts? The Globe did a study a couple of years ago, and they asked, if Massachusetts were a nation, how rich would it be? And it turned out it would be the fourth richest nation in the world, after Norway, Luxembourg, and Singapore. Now, that's maybe good news for us, but the bad news is the University of Wisconsin says we have the same level of income inequality in Massachusetts as the state of Mississippi. So, if we're the fourth richest nation in the world, why Mississippi? Why not Norway? I mean, Norway has a much higher level of shared prosperity, a much broader middle class. We're not aspiring to what we're capable of doing with our resources. So the answer to that is pretty simple. We have a very unbalanced economy. People have already referred to it. The top 1% have gained almost all income and wealth gains of the past 40 years have been going to the top 1%. And that is unbalancing our economy in a very drastic way. But it was not always that way. For the 40 years preceding that, we were building shared prosperity in this country through the union movement and through government transfers, through progressive taxation. And I was born in the middle of that period, 1959, and that was a very different time where we were aspiring to much greater things than we are now on the economic level, and I'm going to make a point that that has an effect on everything else. But I mean, I really like the way Thomas Piketty put it in his book on Capital in the 21st Century. He said that period of shared prosperity in America and Europe was the only period, that 40 years was the only period, the only generation, you could almost say, or two generations in human history where it mattered more what you did for work and how you educated yourself than whether you inherited or married into wealth. The only time in human history, and it's over. We're no longer in that period. We're back in a period where it's more important what you inherit or how much money you marry into than what you do in your life for work and thinking and developing yourself. That's a pretty drastic change and a very disturbing one. So we're here to talk about three big issues. They're all very interrelated. I think it's clear that inequality of power and wealth are very crucially connected to environmental destruction and militarism. I think everyone in this room would probably see those as deeply connected. I have maybe a more controversial point to make, which is the order in which you have to address these things somewhat. It's not an either or, but it is a strategic point, I think, worth making. The nations with the greatest shared prosperity, I mean, Norway, if you like, do the most about climate change and militarism as nations in the world right now. There's a reason for that. When people are struggling just to survive, when workers are struggling just to put food on their table, global crises like militarism and climate change recede into the background of necessity. And that's something that is very perilous to the world when that happens. So it's very important that we at least need to be promoting and fighting for a world of shared prosperity if we are to convince working people that these other crises are as imminent to them as the daily struggle for survival is. Doesn't mean we have to solve those problems, but we have to show that we're committed to solving them and make real progress towards solving them. So I think you would agree, when lives and families are sustainable, it's possible to think about global sustainability. And we need to sort of address those things in a clear way if we want to make progress. So I'm also representing Raise Up Massachusetts today, which the Service Employees International Union and the Teachers Union and many of the organizations that people are involved in this room have been making happen. And we are trying to address this question of shared prosperity in a very broad and powerful way. And I think the way to think about it is building shared prosperity in Massachusetts from the bottom up by raising wages and benefits. And we did that over the last 2 years by winning the highest minimum wage, statewide minimum wage in the United States, and by passing the best mandatory sick time policy at the statewide level in the United States in 2 years. So that was a big accomplishment. We also have to do it from the top down, as Chuck was saying. We have to ask the top 1% and the top 1/10 of 1% to pay their fair share into this system, into this society. And then we have to use that revenue to build from the middle out by investing in jobs, through transportation and other things, and through education, teaching, early education, public schools, public higher education should be debt-free for everybody in America. So we're working on those things right now. So I was also asked, what kind of social movement do we need to build this? And I would say there are three pillars on which we build this social movement. And they're not the three pillars that have been mentioned so far, which are issue pillars, of justice and anti-militarism or peace and environmental protection or, a safe environment. It's actually, I like to think in institutional terms. For me, the three pillars are labor, community, and faith. And the reason I say that is because those are institutional places where people organize themselves. And I'll give you an example. When you organize people where they work through their union, and where they live through their community group, and where they worship through their congregation, you are organizing people broadly, a majority coalition, and in depth. And I say in depth because there's a lot of overlap with those institutions. I mean, I have a member, Wilfredo and Lynn, who said to me one day, Harris, I belong, through my congregation at St. Stephen's, I belong to the Echo Interfaith Organization. In my neighborhood in Ward 4, I belong to Neighbor, my community group. And as a worker, a Medicaid worker, I belong to SEIU 1199. And that guy can tell you about any issue we're talking about today as articulately as any of us. He understood money in politics, he understands climate disaster, he understands the fight for a peace in the world, but it's because he's touched in all those places and he really is involved those ways. And I think Chuck made a good point that the kind of environmentalism that he described fighting that pipeline is community. It's an institutionally based where it's not just an issue, and that's what makes it so powerful. So I think we really need to build a movement like that. That would build it in depth and breadth, and that would be the basis for recognizing all of our interconnectedness on having a peaceful, sustainable, secure, and economically, prosperous world for everybody. So thank you very much for having me today. And I'll pass it on to our next speaker.
Just because my brother started standing up, I'm going to stand up, and now it's going to be a tradition, but you guys can do whatever you want. I don't want to force anything here. I'm going to go off my script a little bit because we're here in the Ivy League, Howard Halls, and I'm going to have to, I wouldn't be me if I didn't push back against that. Not a little bit, but a hell of a lot. I'm going to say some words, and I'm going to see who knows it, so it's a little bit of a test. Royal must fall. Tell me if you know what that is. All right, so this school, right, Harvard Law School, was founded by a donation, one donation, in 1730, endowed the first ever law professorship at Harvard University. Harvard Law School didn't exist at the time. That came from, I don't say a person who owned slaves, because that sounds, it's a passive way to say it, from a slaver. But it was actually worse than a person who owned slaves or a slaver. It was someone who also sold slaves. It was also someone who killed slaves. I actually can't say murdered, because actually at the time that was a legal thing to do, but killed and tortured slaves and encouraged others, because there was an uprising in Antigua, and the royal family did that. The seal of, there probably is one in this room, but I can't see it. And if there was one in front of me, I was going to take it down. I wasn't going to I wouldn't stand behind a Nazi one, and I wouldn't stand behind a royal one either, or a Harvard Law one, which took it from the royal family. So there's a movement going on, and have people heard of Tapegate? Y'all know that? Do people come through the hallway in Wasserstein downstairs and see the response to Tapegate? Yeah. So a bunch of things are happening at this university, at this law school, to rebel against a system. Because this school itself and the Ivy League and in the educational system in this country are factories for the common thought in this country. Because people come out and they think in a certain way, and I went to law school and I said, you have to think in this way, and you can argue both sides of issues. And a lot of times, the other side of the issue, almost all the time, is the evil side. Right? And this school teaches you that, right? And all law schools teach you that, but essentially Harvard Law School and Yale Law School teach those things. And so folks can go online, folks can go downstairs, folks can talk to the black law students and Students for Inclusion here at Harvard Law School and find out about Royal Must Fall. That's connected to a multinational movement at Oxford University. What do y'all think it is at Oxford University? Oh, say what it is at Oxford University. They have a very famous scholarship there, right? The most famous one in the world, named after
Cecil Rhodes.
And so it's who must fall at Oxford? Rhodes must fall. And some folks in sub-Saharan Africa are talking about what? Rhodes must fall. So that isn't just, and I'm going to use that to segue into talking about movements today and movements here in the United States and across the world, and the Black Liberation Movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. But that's part of what's happening here. Downstairs right now, there are stickers on the African American, Black, and African professors also, which are very few at this university and at this law school, supporting those folks. So you actually can go and put a sticker and support some of those folks. Some of those folks actually said things about the fact that people put black tape, in the last few days, people probably know, put black tape over the black professors' faces here. I had a discussion, I spoke here yesterday, and a lot of the faculty here was like, it couldn't have been a student. A student here would have never done that. I said, who said it was a student? We thought it was faculty. Right? They say, oh, someone came in off the street at 3 o'clock in the morning to door pass something, because no one at Harvard would ever do that. So I say that, and I'm going to segue into, I'll come back to that in a second, but talk about this moment, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Black liberation movement that's going on in this country. And when the introduction happened, we were talking about intersectionality. And in the Black liberation movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, so there's a lot of pieces to that, because what that means, and I won't go into all of that, but there are a lot of different groups, a lot of different organizations, a lot of different individuals that don't particularly agree, just as there are in many other segments of our activism. But the three people who actually came up with the idea of saying those words together, Black Lives Matter, that's Alicia Garza, Opal Timseti, and Patrisse Cullors. They, in their thought, and they, in their individual, who they are individually, are intersectional. A lot of times, they were just on, in Cosmopolitan magazine, they were on a cover of something else, but have been sort of lauded for their work and seen as leaders in this movement, and rightfully so. They are women. They are Black. They are some queer. They are Latina, right? We, as Black people in this country struggling for freedom, are intersectional in ourselves. So it isn't an overlap. So I'll just agree, actually, with what someone said. It isn't an overlap of issues. It is an identity of issues that we all are. I am an overlap of some issues. I'm Black and I'm Native and I grew up poor and I'm not anymore. But those are different things and different pieces that overlap in all of us, right? And what the Black Lives Matter movement has, it didn't go out and say, we want to talk to our LGBTQ brothers and sisters and other folks, brothers and sisters and other folks. So it didn't say, we want to go talk to these people. It was those people, right? It didn't say, we're going to go talk to the immigrants' rights movement, right? One of the people is a first-generation Nigerian immigrant herself, right? One of the people who founded Black Lives Matter defines herself as African and Nigerian, not as African American, right? So those things were at the very core of the foundation of this movement. So when people started talking about Palestine, it wasn't because they said we should talk about Palestine, it's because people already were. Because people in the Black Lives Matter movement, of course, African Americans, Black people, Africans in the United States, shockingly enough, are Muslims, right? So those things came absolutely naturally to it. It wasn't like we went to something else to find those things. And I think that's crucially important. Some folks in the room know about it. I see you in the back. But talking about Black and Palestine, from the jump, right from the beginning, that was, no one had to convince anyone, no one had to sell anyone on it, no one had to explain Palestine. The Dream Defenders of Miami, folks who are in this room, folks across the country have said, the struggle that Palestinian folks are struggling, the struggle that Arab Americans and Muslims are struggling for in the United States, issues about Syria, those are natural to us. Those make sense to us. Those are sort of, I'll even use the word indigenous to the struggle of the Black Lives Matter movement and the struggle for Black liberation. So I'm going to tell for anyone, I see some other folks in the room whom I just spoke at a thing last night with Community Change and the great work they're doing, the anti-racism work they're doing in Massachusetts. So I'm going to tell a story that I told last night, so apologies to anyone who heard this before. And it's a silly joke, so I apologize for that. So there are two fish swimming in a stream, right? Two young fish. And they're having a nice time, they're swimming along, and they can talk. This is my story. And an older fish swims up next to him and says, the water's really nice today, isn't it? And the two fish look and say, yeah, the water's really nice. And the two younger fish swim on, the older fish swims away. They swim a little bit longer, and one of the younger fish looks at the other younger one and says, what the hell is water? That's what is happening today. It's what is happening literally in this room and in this building at Harvard Law School. We don't notice the water because it's always been there. We were born in it. We swim in it. You can't taste it. You can't smell it. You can barely even feel it because it's always been around us. That has a name. It is a system. It is white supremacy, right? It is white supremacy. That is why when we talk about immigration, right, we always say, oh, immigrants are treated poorly in the United States. I'm going to say something very radical to y'all right now. Immigrants are not treated poorly in the United States. Everyone's looking at me like, what is he about to say? He better come out of this. Immigrants of color are treated poorly in the United States. And you need to say that. When's the last time anyone said a damn thing about a Norwegian immigrant, right? If someone came from immigrant, yes, there are illegal Norwegians in, I should say undocumented. There are undocumented Norwegians in Massachusetts. And what are we going to do about it? When I went to the University of Wisconsin, right? The year that I came, that's when it shifted. Most of the undocumented people in Wisconsin were from geography, where?
Scandinavia.
No, closer. Canada.
Right.
They were all from, it's right there. They just have to walk across, and they're saying things like magazine and flag. I was like, they're illegal. We need to do something about them. I'm kidding. I wouldn't call them illegal. But that's who it was. Nobody talked about immigration, illegal undocumented immigration. Nobody said that's a bad thing. We shouldn't have these people here, right? When it switched, it's about 2003, 2004. That's when it switched from mostly people from Canada to mostly people from Latin American countries that historically the United States had bombed and done terrible things and stole their resources. So they wanted to come and get some of the stuff that's theirs, naturally, and said, look, we want to work here because you stole all of our resources, which seems to be a natural thing for human beings to do. When that happened, then people started talking about immigration. People say, we don't want these people in our state. We don't want these people in our country. And they started electing crazy anti-union governors in Wisconsin. But that, I think we should also talk about that. The reasons that you have presidential candidates saying crazy things about refugees, that say crazy things about immigration, that say we need to bomb countries back into the Stone Age, they're talking about black and brown countries. So the struggle for black liberation is not a thing that's saying, we just want the police, and I'll say we do want the police in Dorchester to stop killing us. We want the Boston police to stop shooting us, killing us, beating us, stopping and frisking us, arresting us for minor or even major drug crimes, because the war on drugs should be over. It should never have started. It is not a failed war. It does exactly what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to incarcerate multi-millions of black and brown, and to a lesser extent poor people, and it does that. So never say that the war on drugs failed, because the war on drugs is part of a system of capitalism to keep poor and oppressed people poor and oppressed, and it's doing that thing very, very well. And they wrote it for that, right? They wrote it to do that. So when someone says the war on drugs has failed, if you say that, you do not understand what the war on drugs was for. Because the people who made it, they wanted it to be that way. And it's working. And we need to understand, just like the water, right? We need to be like, oh, there's water around us. I didn't notice that. So one thing I just wanted to talk about specifically is the thing that we can all do. As a lawyer, we have a thing called movement lawyering, that we talk about how we can be with people and how we can support and be part of social movements and movements for liberation. And we got a 5-step plan for that, because we're lawyers and we like lists. But this works, I think it works well, and y'all can apply it to the work that you do and the work that you see others doing. And it goes like this. The first thing that we do as lawyers is not like litigate, not decide what the case is, not look up a bunch of case law. The first thing we do is show up, right? We're there for people. So when Black Lives Matters demonstrates with 15,000 people in the streets to protest the non-indictment of the murderer, Darren Wilson, we go to the protest, we're there, right? And we see people and we say, well, you seem to be being aggressive with those police. Damn good for you. We're here, and we're here with some other lawyers, so when people get arrested, they shouldn't, but we're here, right? We show up. The second piece of that is without an agenda. We don't come there and say, all of you people who are here, you should sign my petition, or you should do my thing, or we have this legislative lobbying piece for you to do. You show up for people, and you're there to see what work oppressed people are doing in their communities, right? To see what they're doing, because that's building that community. That's building that trust. So first thing is show up. Second, when some people say show up and shut up, I don't like that, but I like show up, come without an agenda. The third is choose sides. When you're there, when you're with oppressed people, you say, this is the side that we're on. We're not here to teach you something. We're not here to force you to do something else or work on some other issue. The labor movement does this constantly. You don't go in with a bunch of janitors and say, here's 10 things you should do because you're doing your things wrong. You're there to build power with those people and to support those people. So show up, no agenda, and choose sides. Support the oppressed people. The fourth one is do work, right? Be there with people and put in work, right? And if people need things to be done, put in that work. And I think a lot of us have a lot of connections to things like this nice room, right? There are a lot of people who would really like to have this nice room to have a meeting or to organize or to work and put events together. And actually, it has been used. It has been used for some good things, also some bad ones. And the last one is, it's specific to the law, but I'm sure you can see it. Know that the law is not the solution for everyone's problems. So I work for the ACLU. A lot of times we go in places and people say, wow, I have an idea. If you guys would just sue those people, and because they're racist or because they're destroying the environment or because they're doing this other thing, you should just sue them, and then they will have to stop doing that, and then we'll be free. I say, wait, the law is the enemy for us in many things. It's what enslaved us. It's what Jim Crow'd us. It's what has the new form of social control, that is the war on drugs, the school-to-prison pipeline. Those are things that are bad. If the Supreme Court, if federal judges, if state court judges were on our side for the most part, we wouldn't have any of these problems to begin with. But it was written into it that that structure and the way that that structure is formed is an oppressive structure in itself. How do you think 3 million people got in incarcerated facilities and another 3 million on probation or parole? I'm like, because that system is part of the thing that we need to destabilize, we need to crush, and we need to change to a just system. But I think those 5 steps are ones that we all can apply to our daily work, to our ways of being, and supporting social movements, joining in with social movements, in our own social movements, making them, and I'll say it because I wouldn't be real if I'm not, making those spaces more inclusive spaces, but also going to other spaces and being in other spaces where people are naturally organizing, right? Where people are naturally organizing in their churches, in their mosques, in their against things that are happening in their community. Here in Boston, in Roxbury, in Dorchester, Mattapan, like every day, things are going on. There are other meetings going on right now where people are doing that type of organizing. So that is the thing that I think we ultimately need to change in this country. And people come to me all the time and say, we need to change these laws. Like, no, we need to change the culture of this country. There was, and I'll just end with this, the realest thing that I've heard in the entire Black liberation struggle, the new Black liberation struggle that has been born after the murder of Mike Brown, is there was a sheriff's deputy who was killed in Texas. And the district attorney of the county and the sheriff of the county came on TV, on Fox News, and said, we're talking about it. And the district attorney, she was furious, and she said, it's these Black Lives Matter protesters, they're doing this, they're creating this situation where people hate cops, and these people murdered this cop because of that, which is not true at all, but that's what she was saying. But then in that rant, she said the single most real thing I've heard anyone ever say in this movement. She said, these people are trying to change our very way of life. And I looked and I said, you are damned right.
Good morning, sisters and brothers. I'm really excited to be here. So I've been thinking about this idea of asking the Massachusetts Teachers Association president to come and speak about, or speak in the context of sustainable security. And in thinking about that, sort of makes sense. In the last 2 weeks, I've attended 2 Safe School Summits across the state in which educators and district attorneys are wrestling at the school level with the same questions that we are wrestling with nationally in terms of how to respond to a climate of fear and uncertainty and danger. Relative in our schools, both to things like school shootings and also the violence that students experience every day in schools. That isn't necessarily about gun violence, but about bullying and racism and leading to the school-to-prison pipeline. And so it's interesting for me to sort of think about how public education in this country is experiencing the same processes that we are experiencing internationally and nationally. And my desire to frame the question of safe schools in the same way that I'm hoping that we can frame the question of safety and security internationally and nationally. And that is to understand that there's been a profound destabilization in each of those places. Public education has been destabilized. It is experiencing, and this is relative to the Raise Up Massachusetts, austerity discourses and austerity practices are destabilizing our public schools. So in Holyoke, Massachusetts, when they decide that Holyoke schools are failing, they say, you have to fix your schools and we're not giving you a penny more to do that. They say poverty is not an excuse. This isn't about money. And they make that argument and they destabilize schools through austerity. They destabilize our schools through charter schools that suck enormous amounts of money out of our public schools to create a two-track system, and the students in public schools have fewer opportunities and fewer choices. They destabilize our public schools by using high-stakes testing, which grew out of the eugenics movement, which is the thing that testing predicts better than anything is the socioeconomic status of the family that the child lives in. They use that to destabilize our schools and prove that our schools are failing. They use a teacher evaluation system that is the same, that brings a quality of surveillance to the daily life of teachers, of educators, that is a microcosm of the surveillance that we are all anxious about and experiencing in the broader level. The processes are the same. And the processes are, as Chuck was saying, about a predatory capitalism, about a way of thinking about public education that's about privatization, that's about attacking the public good, the possibility of the commons, and leaving each of us, if we're not careful, in a space where we're incredibly anxious, we're profoundly stressed, and we experience ourselves as isolated from each other. That's how they destabilize. So it's not just an economic destabilization, it's not just the violence of racism, but the result is a way that we come to know ourselves in the world as isolated and separate and unable to respond to that. That's the target, that's the idea. So when I understand that context for public education, it helps me to think about what do we need to do in order to grow resistance, not only to preserve public education, not only to preserve the strength of union democracy within public schools, but to connect that to the larger project as we move into the next phase, as we make this transition to the new world and have an opportunity and a moral responsibility to create the world that we want. Public education is a space we can do that. They know that. Our enemies understand very clearly that the possibilities of public education as a place to create people with a capacity for empathy, with a capacity to ask critical questions of our political structure, to join together then through a shared understanding to act, that's what public school can be. So they're working very hard to make sure that isn't what it is. And when we push back, and we organize. We have to organize around a vision for public education that includes that it can be an activist space, that it's an organizing space, that it is a space where young people begin to have the opportunity to experience themselves as powerful in the world. Powerful not as individuals, but powerful as people connected to each other, creating the world that we want. As a union leader, it's important for me, and it's the work that we're trying to do within the MTA, to begin to do that within our union as well. Too long, our unions have worked to, at best, sort of accommodate ourselves within a system that was destroying a lot of people. We can't do that anymore. As Carl was saying, we need to take sides. And we need to take sides with our students who are homeless, who experience the violence of racism every day as they walk in the world, with their parents who are working 3 jobs and still don't have health insurance. We need to take sides in a very serious way. And so our unionism needs to grow. Our unionism needs to be, include our bread and butter issues, but deepen to, at the workplace site, to a demand for democracy in the workplace, and democracy not just in the workplace for educators, but for democracy in the workplace for every working person. Our union demands need to grow for economic and racial justice. That's why I'm so excited to be a part of the Raise Up Coalition. And our union demands need to include our union experiences, and again, I really appreciate the way you frame this, going to other spaces, going to the spaces where our students live, going to the spaces where their parents experience and live their faith and do their community organizing. That level of social justice unionism is going to be key to the movement that we want to build. And what it offers, and what I try to talk to my members about all the time, in living that version of unionism, we are already resisting. You know, the regime under which we all live right now is a regime that works very hard to narrow the ways that we get to know ourselves in the world. That's what testing does, right? It narrows a student's way of knowing herself in the world. That's what the teacher evaluation system does. It narrows our sense of what's possible in the classroom. So our job in living this, in being here, in the ways that we come together, we are resisting. And I think it's really important to remember that, because these are, I appreciate that we're lucky to be here, but damn, it's scary sometimes, right? Who knows which way it's gonna go? It's going to go the way we want to go the more we live together in these possibilities, claim our space, value our humanity and the humanity of our brothers and sisters, and grow our movement by living our movement. So that's what we're trying to do in the MTA. That's what we're trying to do in the coalitions that we're a part of. And that's all I have to say. Thanks very much.
I am so inspired. I feel so lucky to be here, to be hearing these words, and I would like to have a union card that says Sustainable Security Member, and maybe we can all be part of that union. I'm going to be speaking a little bit more about being a volunteer and what it means to be active, because that's where the climate movement is now. It's active, and we have so many people signing up, getting involved, and I believe it's for basically the same reason I'm doing it. I don't want to be alone, and there's so much more strength and power by working together, and you can feel that by not being silent, you have a truth to carry to other people. Just like I'm getting nourished here by what I'm hearing, and that helps me to talk to other people. And I think this word security is really a good one, because everybody has fears. And if we can say, well, wait a minute, we know a way to sustainable security that makes everybody feel at least more safe. So the climate justice movement is all about sustainable security. This movement of multiple campaigns has a shared vision that a just transition to a sustainable, clean energy economy can be achieved, one that doesn't expose local communities to pipeline leaks or expose workers' pension funds to the loss of value by holding on to fossil fuel assets, or expose frontline communities to housing displacement in the code name of flood prevention. The test of climate justice is that the solutions to the crisis must involve the most impacted and vulnerable communities. The focus by all must be a commitment to address the disproportionate burden of climate change on poor and marginalized communities. And there are a lot of indigenous people that aren't in this room that have shown us the way to sustainably living with the environment, and their voices need to be heard at the highest levels. I think that in New England we are at a beginning stage of listening to each other and showing up for each other's actions. People have mentioned the Black Lives Matter events. There was a rally for refugees last night, that huge turnout, and the March for $15 minimum wage had a real mix of people. By the way, mark your calendars for December 12th, Saturday, the day after the Paris climate talks ends. We'll be joining forces with our allies in the labor and immigration movements for a massive rally for jobs, justice, and climate. It'll be on the Boston Common from 1 to 3. That's December 12th. What is the climate movement? What started as a campaign focused on individual actions to reduce the demand for carbon and fuel consumption is now a global political campaign to stop the supply of carbon and methane. That is a campaign to keep it in the ground. Last week, for example, there have been 40 people so far arrested in West Roxbury. What are the arenas the climate movement is organizing to address the crisis? As a volunteer, I'll briefly summarize 5 of them. For starters, advocacy for public policies that are consistent with the limits of carbon budget. A very short window is available to take measures to stay within the limit of using no more than 1/5 of known carbon reserves. This is a carbon emissions budget that is referred to. If we blow the emissions budget, atmospheric temperature will increase by more than 2 degrees Celsius in a mere 30 years, exposing communities to disastrous environmental, financial, and human consequences. One of these consequences is that state and municipal budgets will be faced with cuts to education and jobs in order to cover costs of climate disasters, adaptation, and mitigation. In other words, a hit to those public expenditures that foster more equity and opportunity. A second arena of advocacy is to rapidly reduce the carbon burning component of our public utilities. Allied groups are agitating at the State House for measures that allow wind and solar projects to flourish and remove the barriers to that. A powerful alliance of over 100 grassroots groups called Massachusetts Power Forward is spearheading this political objective. A protracted battle is underway against the public utility companies that outrageously are blocking sensible plans to achieve clean energy accessible by all income levels. This month, the climate movement is targeting the Obama administration's woefully inadequate pledges for the Paris climate talks. Organizations are pressuring for pledges much higher reductions in greenhouse gas emissions by 2025 and reparations for the damage that we have inflicted on others with the climate impacts. Progress is happening more locally, though, where communities like Cambridge are enacting policies and programs to achieve net zero carbon at the instigation of grassroots groups such as Mothers Out Front and Green Cambridge. The increase in renewable energy in Massachusetts has direct economic benefit by reducing the flow of billions of dollars of exported economic value to out-of-state fossil fuel businesses. A third area is divestment. As long as we invest in the fossil fuel companies, we help prop up their political power. As long as that political power remains, the response to climate change will always come too slowly. They'll continue to make sure we never get a price on carbon to reflect the damage it causes. Our state pension fund holds over $1 billion in the top fossil fuel companies, and 350MA and Divestor Pensions Now are lobbying for a bill to remove those funds over 5 years. A divestment coalition of unions, environmental, and climate justice groups is forming to exert more pressure on elected officials to ensure a fossil-free portfolio. Money divested from public and private institution accounts could be invested in climate solutions, upgrading the grid, developing renewable energy installations, investing in conservation and energy efficiency, and training for green jobs. Climate activists see common cause with public transit justice activists also lobbying at the State House. The fourth area is carbon pricing, considered a critical strategy for decarbonizing the economy. Another new coalition of citizens and business groups is gaining ground with a call for measures to place a price on the use of carbon. In other words, pricing to cover the external cost to society for dumping carbon dioxide into our shared atmosphere. Perhaps the most visible arena of the climate movement is resistance to new fossil fuel infrastructure. The fight is on to stop unneeded pipeline projects. The defeat of the Keystone Tar Sands pipeline is tremendously encouraging, and for which we owe huge gratitude to First Nation peoples and groups such as Bold, Nebraska. But many fights are going on locally. Stop the Northeast Pipelines is organizing across Western and Central Mass, and Resist the Spectra Pipelines in Eastern Mass. A few elected officials across the region have questioned the need for new fossil fuel infrastructure, such as Attorney General Maura Healey. Her office this week issued results of an investigation into the supposed demand for more gas supply. The conclusion? The state can meet its electricity needs without the new gas. Another upcoming fight is against a proposed tariff by the utilities and endorsed by the governor to cover new fossil fuel infrastructure expenses of private companies. In short, transitioning to renewable energy is within our capability and already developed technologies, as is the policy know-how to make the energy transitions. The challenge now is building the social power. We saw the potential last year at the People's Climate March in New York City. That was what made the march so overwhelmingly joyful for me, and I know for many others here today. What gives me hope is that the climate crisis could spur an economic transition and the potential for increasing prosperity across disadvantaged communities. People are seeing with new eyes, as Joanna Macy says, and the people are rising with a renewing kind of energy. I look forward to our connections and conversations today.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Cassandra Ben Sahi, and I'm here from an organization known as Epica. And Epica stands for Ex-Prisoners and Prisoners Organizing for Community Advancement. Our contribution to building sustainable security has to do with tearing down the mass incarceration and decarcerating our state. So, as a formerly, or I always like to say a returning citizen, formerly incarcerated person, I realize that there are so many barriers for people who are returning to society that we must overcome. Our organization, the way we define our success is by treating leadership development as a proactive and systemic investment in building a pipeline of leaders within our organization. We're not only talking about taking people out of prisons, but keeping them out. We are talking about campaigns that are going to reform the criminal justice system. Once we reform the criminal justice system, we'll save money, we'll capture those funds, and funnel those funds into the community to create jobs. For me, when my life spiraled out of control, I lost my children to the system. I was placed in prison. And when I came out, I had that mark of a criminal. I wasn't able to find a job. I wasn't able to even go to school. I wasn't able to get housing for my family, so I wasn't able to get my children back. Had it not been for opportunities provided to me by this organization to give me the sense that I was worthy, that I had a place in the community again, that there was something that I could still do, that I wasn't just locked out of everything. They told me that I had a voice, that I had a story to tell, that I could be useful in the community, you know, that once again, there was something that I could do meaningful in this life. So, when we talk about decreasing the system, in the last 6 years, there's been a decline in the system due to some of the reforms that we've been a part of passing. But that was like the first wave. We now need a second wave. We must restore human dignity. Dealing with people not as bad people, but create opportunities on a local level, looking for new ideas, innovative, diverse partnerships with employers. Because, you know, we can talk about job training all day, but if there's no access to the jobs, then the trainings are useless. We have to invest in our youth and make sure we're looking at the collateral consequences. We need to change the mass incarceration rate and the growth. We must stop disconnecting people from society due to the mistakes that they've made and paid for. We have all done something we're not proud of in our lives, but we don't have people reminding us of it all the time. I'm talking about a way to recognize redemption in poor blacks, Latinos, whites, ways to keep our youth engaged and encouraged, excited about their future. If you think about it, people, what do you want to do in the years to come? What do you want to say you fought for? What do we stand for? Justice, equality, and ending mass incarceration. That's what's going on today. 1 in 4 kids go to sleep without food. Housing is a big issue. Yet prison systems are getting stronger and bigger. We need to calibrate the system, reduce the length of incarceration by ending things like mandatory minimum sentencing, saving the state money, and using those funds to right the jobs problem. Creating schools to help our youth. These bills that we talk about today will create billions of dollars to create jobs and opportunities for people. Our bills are called, there's one called the Justice Reinvestment Bill. It's fashioned after a movement that we're going to talk about in our workshop, Jobs Not Jails. That is a people's movement. So if you come to our workshop, we'll talk more about Jobs Not Jails and how you can get involved in it. It's a real powerful movement, and it's sweeping across the state. I'd just like to say that because of the opportunities I was given at Epica, I am now the director of the organization. I help identify leaders. I share the knowledge that I get, the education. I register to vote. I fight for these campaigns to get passed. I've been a part of passing laws like removing the criminal question box off all applications in the state of Massachusetts. That's a law today, you know? So even though that's a law and we get our foot in the door, you still have to sell yourself. So someone has to tell people what it's like to sell yourself, what it's like to build yourself up. I'm proud to say that I'm a face today of what it's like to be rehabilitated and what it's like to have your place in society. I remember what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I'm that face today. Thank you.